The third panel was on religious populism and recognition of Indonesia. The fourth and fifth panels looked at India and Pakistan and their populisms respectively. Each of these panels have recordings, videos, and reports available both on our website and YouTube channel, so please be sure to check them out. These reports and panels are of invaluable use to scholars, analysts, and the broader audience, as well as anybody really who's interested in understanding the current issues and threats posed by populism to democracies in today's world. So again, please be sure to check out our YouTube channel because we have these panels up there as well as other ECPS programs. Today's session of Mapping for Populism, we will look at populism and authoritarianism in Singapore and Malaysia. We are extremely grateful for the expertise, time, and energy of both our moderator and all our panelists today. Thank you so much. That being said, I will introduce our moderator and our panelists. Today's moderator is Dr. Garry Rodan. He is an emeritus professor of politics and international relations at the College of Arts, Business, Law, and Social Science at American University, as well as an honorary professor at the School of Political Science and International Relations at the same university. Prior to this, he was director at the Asia Research Center at American University and professorial fellow of the Australian Research Council. His research interests include the relationship between capitalist development, social change, and political regime directions in Southeast Asia, attempting to characterize and explain the dynamic and durable forms of authoritarian rule has been a particular focus, especially in Singapore. Our first speaker, and I apologize if I pronounce the names incorrectly, is Dr. Ahmad Fauzi Abdul Hamid. And his speak will be on political Islam and Islamic populism in Malaysia and its implications for nation building. Dr. Abdul Hamid is a political science professor at the School of Distance at the University of Sains, Malaysia. He was a visiting senior fellow at the ISEAS Yusuf Ishnak Institute, Singapore in 2016. He had his undergraduate and master's studies at the University of Oxford and Leeds, respectively, and earned his PhD in politics from the University of Newcastle, United Kingdom. His research focuses include political Islam in Southeast Asia, Islamic movements and Islamic thought and Muslim non-Muslim relations. He is also a member of numerous boards, including the Journal of Religious Studies and the Journal of Asian Humanities. To name a few of the selected book chapters, Dr. Abdul Hamid has written on religious diversity in Malaysia in 2018 and has co-authored a chapter on political Islamists in electoral politics in a book titled Democracy at Work in 2017. Our second speaker will be Dr. Syaza Farhana Mohamad Shukri. And her speech will be on populism and politics in Pakistan. Dr. Shukri is a political science researcher and associate professor at the International Islamic University of Malaysia. Her areas of focus and specialization look at comparative politics, especially political Islam and the democratization in the Middle East, Southeast Asia, as well as the home country of Malaysia. She has published numerous book articles, chapters, and journal articles, as well as completed a number of research projects on her doctoral research, including additional areas of research, including populism, public policy, anti-politics, geopolitics. She's also a member of a number of board and professional bodies, including the American Political Science Association and the Middle East Studies Association, just to name a few. Our third speaker will be Dr. Kenneth who unfortunately will not be joining us today. However, he has sent us a lovely recording, which we'll play. But his section will be titled Authoritarian Populism in Singapore. Rodan is a political all-rounder who has vast expertise in disciplinary studies in political science, public management, policy studies, sociology, urban studies, and cultural studies, as well as film and media, just to name a few. He has appeared in multi-dimensional qualitative imperative work and has offered a critical analysis of Singapore as a developmental state and a global city. He also won a number of prestigious teaching awards, that recognize a scholarly and innovative approach to interdisciplinary, social, transformative, and highly interactive teaching and learning that combine the best of liberal arts and professional modes of education. In one of the more recent publications, Dr. Tulpop edited a book titled Singapore's First Year of COVID that looked at public health and authoritarianism in populism authoritarian populism in 2022. This brings us to our last speaker, Dr. Shanon Shah Mod Siddiq, and her talk will be on populism. His talk, will be on populism, religion, and anti-LGBTQ plus attitudes in Malaysia. Dr. Shah is definitely an accomplished academic and lecturer in the fields of religion and social science at the King's College of London. Prior to joining King's College as a lecturer, he served as a research officer at Inform, where he contributed to research on new religious movements, with particular focus on those associated with Islam and Judaism. His academic journey also included a role as associate lecturer in religious studies at the University of Kent, as well as deputy editor of Critical Muslim at the Muslim Institute, if I got that correctly. Dr. Shah's research and teaching focus are on various aspects of religion, nationalism, gender, sexuality. His expertise also extends into the fields of art and popular culture, religious innovation, and contemporary religious movements in Malaysia and Britain. In 2011, Dr. Shah was awarded the Shalford Prize. As a reminder, I would like to remind you that we do have Q&A sessions at the end of today's panel, so please either write down your questions or put them in the chat, and we'll have each panelist address them accordingly at the end of the session. We also have this panel recorded, so please keep that in mind. Thank you for your time again, energy panelists, and for our lovely audience for joining us. Dr. Rodan, I leave the floor with you.
Thank you very much, Neo, and thank you to the European Centre for Populism Studies for inviting me, and particularly Bulent, so that I can be involved in this. The relationship that we're exploring here today is that between authoritarianism and populism. And in the cases of Malaysia and Singapore, authoritarianism has long roots, both dating back to colonisation and apart from brief periods of quite determined contestation in the early periods of independence, authoritarianism did take different paths in these respective countries. Populism, by contrast, has not been examined as much in the literature, and I'm going to return to that a bit later on in my comments, but don't get too worried, that'll only be a few minutes away. The point that I'd like to make is that if you look at Malaysia and Singapore and want to begin to ask the question of whether there's a relationship between authoritarianism and any contemporary manifestations of populism, you really need to ask yourself about the different coalitions and the political economy of the dynamics between members of the coalitions that have been in power in both Malaysia and Singapore. What you'll find is that a different character of and rationales for authoritarianism and the effectiveness of authoritarianism can be distilled from the literature on Malaysia and Singapore. In the case of Malaysia, it was very early in the period of independence that the political project of UMNO, which became the dominant ruling coalition, was that there needed to be an ethnic Malay bourgeoisie fostered and ethnic Malay bureaucrats, and ideologies of race and ethnicity and religion were very important to that. And there's a lot of documentation of this and continuing scholarship on that in the literature. By contrast, in the case of Singapore, it was a group of technocratic politico-bureaucrats and who managed to get hold of power in the struggle in that particular case. And its ideologies of elitism, really centering around meritocracy, have been the main basis for claiming the legitimacy of that particular coalition. Over time, though, in both cases, regardless of these differences, capitalist development did increasingly pose challenges for these coalitions, because the state capitalist models, despite their differences that were prevalent in these two countries, were accompanied by rising material and, in many cases, social inequalities. And in the case of Malaysia, endemic corruption, often amplifying some of those cleavages either related to or separate from social class. In Malaysia, these challenges to the ruling coalition over many decades have ultimately resulted in the formation of emerging coalitions to try and challenge UMNO, and effectively challenging UMNO in the formal political sphere. But these challenges have come, one, from groups who are seeking democratic change, but also from the defenders of the authoritarian political regime, which is based on Malay political supremacy, espousing also Islamic religious nationalism as a basis for challenging UMNO. Hence, in 2018, the first change in the ruling coalition since independence in 1957, in a context of rising political polarisation. And as many listeners will know, that that was the first change in the ruling coalition, and one that would have been unanticipated by many at the time. But beneath the surface, there were these conflicts and there were these coalitions. Now, this coalition that formed to take government, the Pakatan Harapan Alliance of Hope, in conjunction with the ethnic Malay Parti Pribumi Bersatu Malaysia, or Malaysia United Indigenous Party, was short-lived. It has since been replaced after a short interlude with another party that was not successful through elections in 2022 by a new coalition that actually sees Pakatan Harapan in a merger, well, not in a merger, but in a coalition with UMNO, and a coalition government led by Anwar Ibrahim as Prime Minister. Now, this would have been unimaginable 5, 10, let alone 20 or 30 years ago. The important thing is that although some of these democratic forces have been in coalitions, one which was short-lived and another which is currently in train, they are also having to contend with elements who are either trying to defend themselves from Democrats, or to defend themselves from people who are also claiming the mantle as the champions of Islam and of true representation of Malays. So there is an intense struggle over state power, and it's not simply over government. It's over the margins of political space for permissible political conflict. And in this, we can see a reassertion and extension of authoritarianism. And I'm sure this is going to come out in the papers that are presented today. It's also worth noting that a string of repressive laws, some of which date back to colonial years and some of which were updated since, have not been repealed, despite the fact that some democratic forces or liberal forces have been in these two post-UMNO dominant governments. In Singapore, we've also seen periodic swings against the PAP at the polls, and they have accompanied widening inequalities. There has been a much greater questioning of the core PAP ideology of meritocracy by so many people who feel that they've missed out on the so-called economic miracle in Singapore. It's got more and more difficult for the PAP to have the same sort of ascendancy at the polls, even though they are still, by virtue of the first-past-the-post system, in a comfortable position and not likely to be replaced in the foreseeable future. But their political legitimacy is being eked away at by some of the conflicts that the PAP has not been able to completely manage. Alongside some redistributive policies, we've seen some creative, administrative and legal curbs on political opponents and civil society critics that distinguish it from the less sophisticated approach in Malaysia. Although in Malaysia, there are many more cracks in the system, have been for a long time, so that's why it has been possible for there to be a change of government, even if there are still serious power bases in the state that are resisting reform. Meanwhile, though, there's been a constant evolving in Singapore of new state-controlled modes of participation in what has been labelled consultative authoritarianism. So they're different sorts of regimes, but they're both facing pressures because of the political economy that has given rise to conflicts that need more management, and in their differing ways, the incumbents of state power have sought to defend authoritarian controls as a way of responding, although also in conjunction with some select attempts to address these problems. Now, the thematic issue in today's forum is really whether, and if so, how, the contemporary character and direction of authoritarianism in Malaysia and Singapore reflects the influence of populism. Now, this might seem an odd question to pose, but because populism has become so much part of contentious politics around the globe in the last decade or so. But literature on authoritarianism in the cases of Singapore and Malaysia is quite extensive, but relatively scant use of the concept of populism or theories thereof features in most of that literature. The major exception, which applies to both countries, which I think is worth emphasising, is Anne Munro Qua's 1996 book, Authoritarian Populism in Malaysia. She argued at that time that the political economy of Malaysia from the 1970s had fostered a communal basis for political populism linked to the specific capitalist model in Malaysia. This was meant to ensure the dominance of UMNO, but for the things, given the things I've told you already, it hasn't quite worked out that way, although she did identify various contradictions that she thought were inherent to that project and to the form of capitalism that was being promoted. So given that, I think that today's forum is one that this centre should be proud to be hosting and for initiating, because to the best of my knowledge, forums examining Malaysia and Singapore and the contemporary significance of populism as a concept and theory are relatively rare. The papers that we have on offer today are very interesting and have great potential based on the abstracts that I've read so far. So I'm looking forward very much to finding out more about what is understood by the concept of populism that they're using and how they explain its attraction or lack thereof in the case studies that they're developing. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Ahmed Fauzi will start to present his presentation. Here we are, Professor Fauzi.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Rodan Keynes, for the invitation to address the EC PS Forum. And thank you, Garry, for hosting this seminar. It's been a pleasure to reconnect back with long friends. I think I last met Garry in Australia more than a decade ago. Okay, it's also a pleasure to reconnect back with Shanon Shah, who I met in Kuala Lumpur a few years ago. I haven't met Dr. Syaza, I haven't met Dr. Kenneth in person. But anyway, I've been spending the last few days looking at a few of Dr. Syaza's works, because I didn't want to overlap her in my presentation. So I'm actually going to speak more about the NGO-based populism rather than a party politics. Because looking at what she has written very competently, I must say, in the last few years, she focused more on party politics, on the, I would say, on the green wave, on Islamist populism. Okay, but I'm going to do something rather different, which is going to the NGO-based populism. So this is basically parts of my presentation, the abstract, a chapter, and I've also, I also relate populism closely with extremism, and also explore the concepts of nativism and Islamism, okay, which are both very important in engendering or in encouraging populism in Malaysia. Okay, this is my abstract, and several key phrases there: the ideology of hatred, okay, which basically underlines populism, Islamist, referring to a politically arbitrary interpretations of Islam rather than Islamic per se, because some authors do conflate between the two and some use them interchangeably. Okay, but I will differentiate between them. And populist in the sense of capitalizing on the popular sentiments of mainly the indigenous Malay Muslim populace or electorate. This is a book chapter which I published this year, which came out in the Routledge Handbook of Non-Violent Extremism. And this must be read in conjunction with my presentation today, which is on nativist expressions of non-violent extremism in Malaysia. Okay, the case of ISMA Islam. And if we look into several definitions, I've defined populism just now. Look into Islamism, a political ideology that demands the establishment of a juridical Islamic state governed by the Sharia. Extremism, which conceives of politics from supremacist point of view. Now, this is very important. If you look whether it's Jewish supremacy, whether it's Muslim supremacy, whether it's Christian supremacy, here we see that this extremist tinge to it. And when in power, the extremists will tend to become intolerant and oppressive towards the other. The other is an anthropological concept which supposes that there's this enemy, okay? There's this silent enemy, okay, which is against the dominant force or the hegemonic force. And I would like to put the Malaysian case as an anomaly. We see that Malaysia's history with a history of a peaceful Islamic propagation, but now, okay, it has been corrupted or spoiled or marred, okay, by what you call extremism. Okay, we see that historically it has a high degree of acceptance of pluralism, and it still does. We see violence very rare, but we see this phenomenon of high degree of extremism and yet a low rate of terrorism or violent extremism. Okay, and I quote here from a former colleague of mine from USM, Francis Lokotwa, who says in his book chapter that Malaysia stands out as an aberration. For although it is multi-ethnic and multi-religious and a relatively new nation, it enjoys considerable political stability. Okay, and you can see the aberration in this graph, for instance, from Pew Research, from surveys that were conducted I think it was eight years ago. We see that based on perception alone, okay, the support for ISIS among Malay Muslims in Malaysia is very high. In fact, higher than Indonesia, higher than Nigeria. If you look into the graph here, it's on the fourth place. Okay, together with, I think it's Senegal over there. Okay, so despite this, we see very low cases of terrorism or violent extremism in Malaysia. So what I would say here is that Malaysia it's an anomaly in the sense that, you know, Malaysia's ISIS conundrum, it's perception based, is attitudinal, but it doesn't flow into actual terrorist violence. Okay, and there are several references here from Joseph Liao and also from Nicholas Chan, who wrote about this anomaly. And we see also an exception in the case that violence committed by Malaysians are mostly done abroad. They didn't do it in Malaysia. Okay, in fact, just few days ago, there were 2 Malaysians who are in Guantanamo Bay today, okay, that were just convicted, okay, not yet sentenced. And if we look at the violence committed by Malaysians, they are mostly abroad. And added to that, the fact that skillful surveillance work by E8 and bad execution, extremely bad execution, basically condemns, okay, these violent extremists to failure. Now, the fact of the matter is that the majority of Islamist extremists are non-violent populists. And the word non-violent here, I think, is very important, because I think that the paradigm used by policymakers and the state, okay, have been mistaken. I'll go that later. So if you look at non-violent extremism or vocal extremism, or if you want to use the word vocal populism, which disavows violence as a matter of principle, but yet it's very dangerous despite being non-violent. Now, if you look in the West, most of us will think that extremism is dangerous because it will lead to violence. It will lead to terrorism. Of course, there's one argument over there in terms of the conveyor belt argument, or a slippery slope argument, that non-violence can eventually lead to violence. In fact, it's also dangerous because non-violent extremism can encourage others, not necessarily those who are involved in it, those populists who are involved in it, but it can actually encourage others through hate speech. Okay, but then I think also it's very dangerous because it's often overlooked by government and by governments, by authorities, okay, because they tend to overlook this type of extremism or populism. Okay, and I quote from Orofino and Alton, who edited that book on nonviolent extremism. What unifies extremists is their rejection of pluralism, legal rules, economic, political, religious, and social system they live within. And we see this in a large matter among those so-called populists as well. So whether you call it populism or extremism, non-violent extremism, I think they are basically, there's not much difference between them. There's a thin line separating them. And if you look at Malaysian style populism, it's mainly nativism plus Islamism. It's not just nativism, okay, in terms of upholding the concept of Malay supremacy, but it's added with a tinge of Islamism. Okay, so we see from the history, of course, Malay nationalism has always been there, okay, rooted from the implied social contract. It's not an actual social contract that was written, but it was actually implied, okay, implied as in the provisions that are contained in the federal constitution. And if you look into Malaysia's federal constitution, it respects or acknowledges Malay indigeneity through national language, through Islam as a religion of the federation, Article 3.1, and the constitutional monarchy, which are the 3 main bases of Malayness. Okay, you could say. Okay, but throughout time, and of course, with the disentanglement of UMNO as the protector of the Malays, this got challenged, and especially reached a peak with the 2018 defeat of UMNO. Okay, so of course, with this developing, okay, the Malay Muslim had to search for a new protector. Okay, and since then, Islamist conservative groups have gained ground, offering populist interpretations of Islamist politics with right-wing extremist elements. Of course, this started basically in 2008, okay, when UMNO was weakened. It lost its 2/3 majority, which it never recovered. And was, of course, globally, you will see another wave around 2016, when Trump became the American president, and then Duterte, okay, became the Filipino president. These are leaders who are known to become known as populists. Okay, if we look at the case of ISMA, okay, which is a group or an Islamist group, okay, which I and my co-author wrote in the chapter for the book. Okay, for me, the basic, okay, the basic weakness, okay, of ISMA's or the basic shortcoming of ISMA's discourse is its racialization of religion. And its discourse is extremely ethnocentric. Of course, its leader, its president, was once convicted in 2016, okay, for publishing an article in ISMA's website, which says that the Indians and the Chinese are migrants, pendatang, okay, newcomers, and not basically implying that they are not citizens, true citizens per se. Okay, I think the Syaza will probably elaborate more about this because she writes about this as well. So we see a close association also with the Muslim Brotherhood, and ISMA openly utilizes, okay, openly approves the concepts of the Muslim Brotherhood. Okay, and in fact, it claims the mantle of as the group which upholds the true teaching of the Muslim Brotherhood. And we see generally, for instance, okay, the penetration of ISMA's discourse into the general Malay Muslim society, which I think is very powerful, although ironically, this does not flow into the ballot box, because most of ISMA's former leaders contested the last elections in 2018 and the Gerakan Tanah Air coalition, but yet most of them lost. Gerakan Tanah Air, then coalition was led by Mahathir Mohamad, the former prime minister twice. Okay, if we look at ISMA's discourse, you can see several methods or mediums in which this populist thinking spreads through society. Firstly, I say here that it's arts, and for instance, the Mat Kilau film. And not many are aware that the producer, Studio Kembara, whose director was a former ISMA vice president. In fact, the former chairman of Studio Kembara later contested in G15 in Putrajaya, okay, on behalf of Pejuang, Dr. Mahathir's party, and on behalf of Gerakan Tanah Air. Mat Kilau, a story about a Malay independence anti-colonial fighter, okay, in the late 19th century and early 20th century, was the highest grossing film of all times in Malaysia. It still holds that record today. And this happened despite, okay, our obsession with internet films and so on. Okay, and another method is through NGO activism, Aman Palestine, okay, which is very popular among the Malays. And if you look into the board of directors of Aman Palestine, most of them are ISMA or former ISMA members. Although there was a case, I mean, just recently, questioning, okay, whether ISMA should retain, because you look in the Societies Act, and in the, okay, NGOs are allowed to keep 30% of the donations they receive from public. So that enables the NGOs to operate, okay, in terms of their costs, okay, in terms of their operating costs and so on. Okay, and yet what it means for ISMA 30% is basically millions of ringgit. So there were voices within social media which question, okay, whether ISMA used that 30% that they kept legally. And intellectual activities. If you look into the link that I give here, International Journal of Interdisciplinary and Strategic Studies, there's nothing wrong with that. It's a normal journal. Okay, but you look at Iris Institute and you look at those who are organizing this journal, again, most of them are mostly ISMA members. So there's this question of confronting extremism or confronting populism, if you want to use that term. Okay, and there's this issue of the focus or obsession of Western funding agencies and also Western patrons of such research who are being obsessed with violent extremism. When I say that most or all or nearly all, okay, of the forms of extremism or populism in Malaysia is non-violent, that means that we are using a different or wrong paradigm in assessing, okay, this phenomenon. And I myself experienced with some of the Western funding agency, okay, when doing research and coming up with results which were not consonant with what these agencies wanted, they refused to publish our results just because there was no evidence of violent extremism or terrorism that we found. So we see this disciplinary bias, especially when you get this obsession with data-driven empirical political science methods. And if we ignore the issues from history, from sociology, input from other disciplines such as anthropology, okay, I think it will inevitably lead to securitization of this subject matter, unfortunately. And in conclusion, okay, I would say that in confronting the populist challenge, Muslim countries need to prioritize local indigenous resources, categories, themes, strategies, strengths, narratives. Okay, this is where the countries and the governments can get the support of the people. They're not getting the support, but this populists getting the support because these populists, okay, these populists exploit the sentimental, then the emotional feelings and the nativist, okay, elements that are present, especially in the present Malay Muslim society. If you look internationally, okay, USA's fumbling in Iraq and Afghanistan, especially in terms of human rights, has rendered this global war on terror meaningless. Okay, I would say. Okay, and a baseline must also be developed and not globally imposed. Okay, because if the basis of human rights used are just the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or even the Egyptian Declaration of Human Rights, okay, it might lead to backlash from among the local population that we are using foreign imposed, okay, foreign imposed measures or foreign imposed categories to assess what we ourselves, okay, should be assessing. And I quote here from Asma Asfaruddin, who's an American academic, who testified actually to the State Department. And you can look here at the her statement delivered in a dialogue with State Department officials. This was back in 2001, I think. It was about 20 years ago. Our, i.e. USA, because she's American, I think, okay, but she's Muslim. USA's failure has been in not being able to reframe the terms of this discourse in terms that are meaningful to Muslims living in the Islamic world. And she says this, okay, very convincingly. Lastly, can I just point you to a book recently written by Romila Tapar, who's a famous Indian historian. She's over 80 years old, I think. Okay, and this is from this book review by Irfan Habib. Our history, their history, whose history? From the review, it's not a very big book, but it's very important because one of the bases, okay, that populists appeal to is an invented form of history. It's an invented tradition. For instance, the story or the issue that this land was Malay Muslims from the beginning, everything was all right until the colonials brought the Chinese, brought the Indians, and so on. Whereas look at the history, a truthful look at history will reveal that we've been pluralists even from the beginning. Okay, and not to mention that there was some of the Chinese and some of the Indians came to Malaysia much earlier than some of the Malays who are from the Indonesian stock, from Java or from Sumatra, who came much later. So these are some issues which I think have not been resolved, and I stop there. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Abdul Hamid, for your amazing presentation. I really enjoyed your opening remarks about how some parties misuse, faith and religion to misinterpret them for their own political gain, and that's being seen a lot in populist discourse contemporarily. Thank you for that. Our next speaker is Dr. Hamid Shukri. May I please just remind all speakers, please do their best to try and keep up with the time limit. We don't want to run a situation further on where we are forced to, cut speakers short. And we want to try to have a really robust question and answer session to our audience. Please do keep in mind that you should just put your questions in the chat. And at the end of our panel, we will, have a nice interaction and discussion. Dr. Hamid Shukri, please take it away.
Thank you, Neo. May I check how many minutes do I have, Neo? 15, 20?
I would 18 is a good middle ground. 15 to 18 if you can. That's fantastic. Okay. Yeah.
I'll try to be as precise as possible. Thank you. Thank you, Villain and ECPS for inviting me for this session. Thank you to Professor Garry for laying out the historical aspects, so that makes my job a bit easier. And also, of course, thank you to Prof. Fauzi, who also have given us a nice, when I saw the tentative flow, I was very happy that Prof. Fauzi would go before me, because he has done a lot of work on Islamism in Malaysia. So I believe he had done justice in explaining to all of us what happened in the country. So again, I will just focus on my main arguments, and it was also an honor to know that Prof. Fauzi actually read my work. So thank you on that. So my topic here is slightly different from the one that I proposed actually. So I propose Islamist Civilizationism in Malaysia, because that is actually a title of a book chapter that was published this year. But I figured this is a discussion on populism. So I tweak it a bit. So I'm going to talk about Islamist civilizational populism, which is actually a title for another chapter of mine coming out next year, probably. So this is an ongoing project of mine to look at what we call Islamist civilizational populism. So basically, like Prof. Garry and Prof. Ahmad Fauzi already talked about, that Malaysia is in a way, it's a plural society whereby the Malays do make up a majority. And we need to remember, in Malaysia, Malays are legally obligated to be Muslims as well. So when we talk about Malayness or native Malays, etc., we're also talking in bracket about Islam and being Muslims. So my main argument is that we've looked at the situation in Malaysia, especially when we talk about inter-ethnic relations, through this ethno-nationalist lens, I might say, right? It's more of the Malays versus the Chinese. Mostly the Chinese. I will explain later why. Prof. Garry already mentioned just now about the 1970s, the economic policies, and how this, in a way, exacerbated inter-ethnic relations. I mean, there's a lot of work on that, a lot of debate on that. But the point I want to make is that is how we've viewed this, and that is how the discourse has been anyway. That is ethno-nationalist populism, we might say, right? Malay, like Prof. Fauzi mentioned earlier, it's about nativism, it's about Malay indigeneity. So that was the focus. But my argument is that, I guess, well, my main argument is that in the past 5 to 10 years, this ethno-nationalist populism have shifted to become Islamist civilizational populism, meaning that rather than just talking about where the Malays, we are the majority in the country, we are the people in the country, right? Using a term in populism, we are the true people of the country. Now the focus is not that we are the Malays, but we are Muslims, and Islamist populists have situated the Islamic identity of Malays in this wider civilizational narrative of the Islamic Ummah, the civilization of Islam, basically. So these are just some background on that, right? Populists refer to Malaysia's majority Malay population as, like I said, the so-called true people, while the Chinese, more than the Indians, are referred to as the others. Why do I focus on the Chinese? Is because we know that when we talk about populism, when we talk about the others, they are usually the elites. And the Chinese have, well, it has been argued, I guess, that the Chinese hold economic supremacy in the country, economic monopoly in the country. So because of this, the Chinese community in Malaysia holds this, I don't know, this unique privilege of being otherized, not just economically, but also ethnically, civilizationally. So the nexus of these two makes them the perfect others in a populist discourse. So that's why the focus on the Chinese and not so much on the Indians. The urge for Islamist populism stems from the Malays' use of emotion, just like Prof. Fauzi mentioned earlier, the use of emotion to instill fear and resentment, particularly towards the Chinese economic supremacy. Again, the idea that this is quote unquote our land, the Malays, so we should, I don't know, be rolling in gold for being the first people of the land, but that's not the situation. But again, like I said earlier, it's arguable. But what the politicians do is they keep on repeating this to the point that it becomes fact, to the point that people are afraid of the Chinese, that's what I'm trying to say. According to Kenneth, the appeal of populists develops only when people believe democracy has failed to properly represent the people's desires. So they feel that the elites have failed to protect the Malays. Understanding the Malay psyche, these populists use religion to define Islam with the framework of civilizationist rhetoric. It is not that the Malays have grown attached to the wider Islamic culture. I think this is my key here. Instead, populist leaders have succeeded in uniting them against a perceived threat under the unifying appeal of an Islamic civilization. Meaning that, what I'm trying to say, it's not that the Malays want to be lumped together in this Islamic civilization or Ummah, but it's more rhetorically, ideationally, you know, the idea that we are part of a larger civilization gives them confidence and strength, but the audience is still domestic. These populists, when they talk about we are part of the Muslim Ummah, they're still talking to Malaysians. They're trying to attract Malaysians within the framework of the inter-ethnic relations that we have and I've mentioned. So I put there a quote by Mahathir Mohamad, who said, "We are all Muslims, we are all oppressed, we are all being humiliated." Right. So again, this is the civilizational language that is used. It's not just that we are Malays in Malaysia facing these issues, it's that guess what? We are Muslims, and we see how Muslims are being treated. We are being humiliated. So again, it's playing with emotion. So people, want to rise up because of this. I've kind of talked about this, so I'm not going to repeat it so much. But I like that. That's the last part that Prof. Fauzi mentioned just now. So it links that, if we look back at history, the Chinese traders have been here for at least 500 years. They've been around. They're not newcomers. They are not, the term that is used, the derogatory term of pendatang. But things changed during the colonization period, whereby the British, in a way, also started this whole, they are the protectors of the Malays. The Malays needs to be protected. So it has continued until today, this idea that Malays need to be protected. Special rights granted to the Malays as indigenous population has also been mentioned earlier. But I always like this quote by our first Prime Minister, who said that, unless we are prepared to drown every non-Malay, we can never think of an Islamic administration. He's just saying that Malaysia was founded as a secular nation, but that's also been contentious, of course. And then, as most of the Malaysian audience here know, that 30 May 1969, we had the racial riots, which was not even national. But the point I want to make is that this is a punctuation in the equilibrium, that because of this, we had the economic policy that Prof. Garry mentioned, and the national culture policy trying to assimilate the Chinese population with Malay culture and customs, etc. So this creates this friction now of Chinese versus Malay. But again, it was still in ethnic nationalist terms. And then we have the rise of institutionalization of Islam. Many have been written about this. So, the idea that in the 80s, we have the rise of Islamization in the country under Mahathir Mohamad with his first term, etc. So my main argument is that this laid the ground for the Islamist civilizational populism that we see today. Because if we don't have this rise of Islamization, there would be no, audience out there for this kind of Islamic populist language. But there is now, because of what was laid down 40 years ago. And then also my other argument is the rise of this Islamist populist is also due to global challenges, 9/11, the global war on terror, etc. That again, it situates Malay Muslims among the larger Muslim civilization. But the key for me, when we talk about the 21st century, we can't ignore social media, because it brings these conflicts closer to Muslims, even in Malaysia, right? So they're checking their social media, they are keeping up with, I put there the Arab uprising more than 10 years ago now, people, Myanmar, in Xinjiang, and of course today on Gaza. So Muslims in Malaysia feel connected to their brothers and sisters in other places. So again, it allows the Islamist populists in Malaysia to really use this to their advantage. And finally, I think that how this Islamist populists came about in Malaysia, I argued that I think I noted down that Prof. Fauzi also mentioned just now, 2008 was definitely the beginning, where in 2008, the long ruling Barisan Nasional did not get 2/3 majority. And then 2013, actually Barisan Nasional did not even win the popular vote. So what happened was that there's a split in the Malay vote, those who were supportive of Barisan Nasional, those supportive of the opposition, etc. And all of this led to the historic 2018 change of government. So the thing was, the 2018 government have part of it, the DAP, the Democratic Action Party, which is a Chinese-based party that used to or still does I'm not sure, promotes this secular Malaysia ideology, but now they've toned it down. So when the DAP is part of the government, what happens is that the Islamists use this to their advantage to claim again that we are under threat, we the Malays are under threat, we the Malay Muslims in Malaysia are under threat. But we understand all of this is a political project, right? It's not really that we are under threat, but it's used by Islamist populists. Interestingly as well, in 2018, the opposition were made up of mostly Malays, Muslims. And that is the situation now as well, which is another story on its own. So what I have here, this should be my last part, some evidence, I guess, of when I say civilizational populism, this whole idea of us versus them. So here are some examples. So Hadi Awang is the current president of the PAS party, which is Islamist party, of course. So we see he said back in 2021, it is forbidden to be together with enemies of the religion and the Ummah. But he's actually referring to the DAP and Pakatan Harapan, but he put it as enemy of the Ummah, of the Muslim. So this civilizational narrative here. He also said last year at the beginning of the Ukraine conflict, now the Zionists have successfully appointed a new head of state, Volodymyr Zelensky, who in a statement said that Ukraine needs to be saved just as much as Israel, showing his true colors. So he equates what's going on with Ukraine and Israel because he knows, you know, Muslims, wherever they are, will be angry at that. And then when the earthquake struck Turkey earlier this year, Hadi argued that many European nations were too consumed with assisting Ukraine to care about and assist a Muslim country in need, which we know is incorrect, right? I can't remember the exact number. I think about 18 European countries were among the first to provide assistance to Turkey. But it doesn't matter to a populist leader. It doesn't matter as long as whatever he says are accepted by the people. And then Muhyiddin Yassin, if you can see in the picture there, the one on the left, during the campaigning last year, he said that Christians and Jews are going to convert Malaysia into a Christian nation. The interesting part is we know that I don't think there are a huge number of Jews in the country, but this is thrown into the mix because again, the civilizational narrative of Islam, Christian, Jews. So this is what has been done. Hadi talked about Islamophobia being a new weapon being used by Orientalists. So again, the idea of Muslims versus Orientalists who are out to I don't know, to do what to the Malays. Interestingly, Hadi also took to his Facebook to say that, you know, he's not anti-Chinese. He's familiar with the Chinese community. His grandfather had offered asylum to the Chinese in World War II. His daughter-in-law, one of them is a Chinese. He's trying to show that he has nothing against the Chinese. And why do I put this here is because I want to show that he is a populist, that he says all of these things, this civilizational narrative, because he knows this is what's going to get him votes. But he also knows that you can't win or govern Malaysia without the support of the non-Muslims. So my conclusion is, yes, it started as more of nativist populism after the May 13, 1969 riot. And then Mahathir, like I said, laid the groundwork for the rise of Islamization in the country because he wants to be a Muslim world leader, especially in the 90s. And then we had the domestic issues, the rise of the opposition, and then with social media, etc. So we have this rise of Islamist civilizational populism who use this civilizational discourse to situate again Malay Muslim in the larger ummah, but targeting Malaysian audience at home. So that's all from me. I think that's beyond 18 minutes. My apologies. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sorry about that. My mic disconnected. That was actually really interesting talk. I think it's really interesting to see the universality in which populist actors can use particular tropes like threat framing, us versus them, and how the people, regardless of where they are, pick up on these tropes and run with them. Thank you, Dr. Shukri, for your talk. That was, really eye-opening. I think we're doing amazing on time. We'll move on to our next panel, which is presented by Dr. Kenneth Paulton. Quick reminder that the questions will be answered at the end of the panel, so please write them in the chat. We'll get all to them. We'll now move to the recording sent to us by Dr. Tan, who again could not be with us due to scheduling issues, but please enjoy the recording he sent. Thank you.
Greetings, my name is Kenneth Paulton, and it's my great pleasure to offer you some tentative ideas about the emergence of authoritarian populism in Singapore. Singapore has long enjoyed an international reputation for political stability, social cohesion, economic wealth, and international connectedness. On so many measures, including GDP per capita, economic competitiveness, low corruption, passport strength, port, airport, airline, higher education, and several others, Singapore ranks among the top in the world and is much admired and even copied by others. Its success has been mostly attributed to the pro-business and globally oriented policies of a sophisticatedly authoritarian government, often acknowledged as clean, meritocratic, and technocratic. The long-ruling People's Action Party, or PAP, operates within a Westminster system that is, in effect, a one-party dominant state. Having won an overwhelming majority of parliamentary seats in general elections that are held regularly and that confer upon the incumbent significant systematic advantage. Political legitimacy in Singapore is, however, principally a matter of the state's ability to meet the basic physiological and security needs of its citizens at a very high level of satisfaction, and holding the monopoly on how this is to be understood and explained in the public discourse. Since the 1990s, some of the most trenchant liberal criticisms of Singapore's practice of democracy, freedoms, and human rights have been increasingly eclipsed by a neoliberal celebration of the Singapore model of governance that so many, including elites in the liberal West, seem to want to emulate. The PAP government prides itself on being able to pursue even unpopular policies that it regards as necessary for Singapore's long-term interests, taking seriously what its first Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew described in realist, pragmatist terms as hard truths. The PAP and its supporters use the word populist contemptuously to accuse its critics and opponents of political posturing that irresponsibly and manipulatively panders to the demands of ordinary people, characterized as selfish, ignorant, and short-sighted. The PAP government makes hyperbolic assertions about how any divergence from its rational policies and strategic principles will lead to the ruin of Singapore. Almost as a reflex action, they dismiss as too easy, overly sentimental, uninformed, technically unsound, or financially unsustainable any bona fide policy alternatives that challenge its orthodoxy in and out of Parliament. But many of such policies actually do point helpfully to the unmet needs of those Singaporeans, as well as other marginalized communities who have fallen behind or are systematically disadvantaged in this national success story. In this short presentation, I would like to argue that in Singapore, populism is still mostly a derisive term of party political rhetoric, regularly weaponized against the ruling party's opponents, regardless of the merits of their argument. However, it has become somewhat self-fulfilling, as the extremely uncompetitive nature of general elections and the worsening perception that ordinary Singaporeans have of their leaders, quality of life, and personal prospects have created conditions that are conducive to the emergence and spread of authoritarian populism, of which early signs are already apparent. A mere 734 square kilometers, Singapore has a population of about 5.9 million, of which only 3.6 million are full citizens. As a post-colonial multi-ethnic nation state and a cosmopolitan global city, Singapore presents itself to the world as a city of opportunity, but to its own people as a nation that lacks severely. At the heart of the Singapore story, its official nation-building narrative, is a vulnerable nation of profound deficiencies that must open itself to the world to gain access to desperately needed resources and opportunities, whose success, no matter how rapidly achieved and glittering, will always be fragile. This narrative of perpetual anxiety, of course, feeds naturally into propagandistic justifications for why the PAP must continue to lead, and to do so with enormous, even unchecked, power. In the survivalist decades following national independence in 1965, the PAP government's developmental agenda was chiefly to attract foreign capital by offering favorable tax arrangements, infrastructure, a pro-business environment, and an educated but low-cost local labor force. To achieve this, the government neutered the labor unions while urbanizing, industrializing, and socializing the population into an obedient resource, tethered to the aspiration of middle-class living and a dependency on the state that such an aspiration would entail. After the mid-1980s, the government became more technocratic, but retained its authoritarian character, finding new and more sophisticated modes of political and social control. It justified its policy choices, which were fast becoming policy formulas, using the language of neoliberalism and managerialism. Such policies, which included the payment of political and public service leadership salaries that were by far the highest in the world, seemed like they were guided by a kind of market fundamentalism. But the language of the market was, for the most part, merely a fig leaf for what was really the concentration of power in the hands of a much less meritocratic, but just as self-congratulatory elite. By the mid-2000s, the government was starting to accelerate the liberalization of its immigration policies. Notwithstanding alarmingly low birth rates, these policies have led to a sharp rise in Singapore's total population and a decline in its proportion of citizens. There have been two main flows of immigrants into Singapore. The larger, often referred to as migrant workers, is mainly made up of South Asian men providing manual labor in the construction, marine, shipyard, and manufacturing sectors, and Southeast Asian women who work as live-in domestic helpers. There are regular reports in the local news of migrant worker injuries, deaths, abuse, and discrimination, perhaps reflecting a dominant view laced with a touch of xenophobia, racism, and snobbery of migrant workers as a cheap and exploitable resource, not worthy of equal rights and dignity. Now, the smaller flow of immigrants, often referred to as foreign talent, is made up of foreigners and with skills and experience that Singapore requires. Immigration policies and foreigners have come to occupy a rather central place in the public imagination. They come to mind when thinking about higher urban density and pressures on the city's infrastructure, when coping with a sense of displacement that Singaporeans might feel in their own city and in terms of job opportunities, and when identifying the causes of income and wealth inequalities. Putting it simply, an increasing pool of migrant workers puts downward pressure on the wages of the poorest Singaporeans, while the increasing presence of foreign talent and the super rich pushes up the salaries of top-earning Singaporeans. This widens the income gap so that on average, Singapore's Gini index, which of course measures income inequality, is significantly higher than the OECD average. As the gap widens, there is an expectation that social mobility will be reduced in an increasingly dysfunctional meritocracy. To counter these views, the government often presents statistics in ways that suggest the problem is not so serious. In reality, though, the lived experience of inequality, especially in a dense, wealthy, increasingly expensive global city like Singapore, is not so easy to trivialize by technocratic sleights of hand, especially when it intersects in a complex way with inequalities of identity involving race, gender, sexuality, class, and age groups. Singapore has become one of the most expensive cities in the world. Median wages have been increasing at a very slow rate over the last couple of decades, leading ordinary Singaporeans to express constant worry about the cost of living. A recent report found that the top 5 issues of importance to Singaporeans were cost of living, salaries and wages, housing affordability, jobs, and the increase in goods and services tax. The same report also identified costs, salaries, housing, and GST as areas in which the government was perceived as underperforming. In one of the wealthiest cities in the world, there are visible signs of not just relative, but also absolute poverty. But no official calculations of a poverty line or enthusiasm for a minimum wage policy. Instead, the government has installed a progressive wage model that is sectorally targeted and very slow and modest in its adjustments. Traditional state welfare is available, but not so easy to obtain. Welfare programs seem to be designed with a high tolerance for inequality and a very pessimistic view of human nature's propensity to abuse the system. But more proactive and substantial welfare schemes are necessary to redistribute the gains from globalization, which creates more losers than winners in the first instance. Singaporeans, though schooled in trickle-down neoliberal thinking and the evils of bloated state welfarism, are today wondering whether their government is doing enough to redistribute globalization's gains, especially in the light of disruptive technology. While Singapore has become a wondrous playground for the few who can afford it, ordinary Singaporeans are quite likely to feel an overall drop in their quality of life. Even foreigners have observed that Singapore is a stressful place to work in. Reports have ranked Singaporeans among the top in the world, where longest hours of work and shortest hours of sleep are concerned. Highly stressed and exhausted all the time, many burnt-out Singaporeans, young and old, often express deep concern about their mental health. They fear their career prospects are limited and many point an accusatory finger at what they deem to be unfair, pro-foreigner, neoliberal practices. Nowadays, these are often the kinds of reasons younger Singaporeans cite for not wanting to start a family and have children, a choice that cycles back to the problem of having one of the lowest birth rates in the world. Thus, a vicious cycle sees Singapore turning unavoidably to immigration as a quick fix solution for maintaining a critical mass of labor and talent in a small country. In these conditions, we are starting to witness in Singapore two developments associated with authoritarian populism. First, xenophobic sentiments are simmering, and they are even catalyzing hitherto pent-up feelings of racism, repressed by decades of multiracial conditioning. Emotionally appealing nativist arguments, especially directed against the PAP establishment's neoliberal immigration policies, can certainly already find fertile ground to germinate. Second, even in a traditionally high-trust society like Singapore, there are clear signs of incredulity, resentment, and perhaps even envy towards the elite, or more broadly, the establishment, who appear entitled, self-serving, heartless, condescending, and arrogant. There is a view that government policies to court foreign talent as new citizens is really a means of diluting popular dissatisfaction with the strongly pro-PAP attitudes of newcomers. Ordinary Singaporeans are confronted with a grating view of how the wealthy and powerful live in crazy rich Singapore. Lee Kuan Yew and his leadership team were careful to cultivate an image of austerity in the early decades of independence. Today, a highly paid political elite have found it difficult, perhaps even unnecessary, to conceal the opulence of their lifestyles. Their elitist attitudes are often betrayed by the numerous faux pas that barely escape the scrutiny and publicity of social media. As today's elite circles become increasingly closed and protected, one can also expect to find institutional decay and cultural and intellectual exhaustion. Much public skepticism has, in fact, been expressed openly about the competency and moral authority of the next generation of PAP leaders. Out of this decadent elite, we can expect to see the emergence of demagogues, fueled by growing intra-elite rivalries. Charismatic and manipulative, they will channel popular energies and frustrations against the traditional establishment and against the plural society in order to build a mass support base. They will instigate moral panic and outrage and be the primary purveyors of conspiracy theories against the elite and against minority communities in an environment that has always severely lacked transparency and access to information, and where online falsehood laws will have the perverse effect of heightening the credibility of censored information. The authoritarian technocrats in power will also be much less restrained in their resort to moral panic as a diversion from their weaknesses and mistakes, which will not only increase in frequency, but also be much harder to conceal and deny. These, I believe, are the key factors that can lead plausibly to a dysfunctional future for Singapore, shaped by authoritarian populism, rather than a liberal or progressive form of democracy. Thank you.
That was really great. I really enjoyed this recording. I hope you guys did too. I think it's a shame that Dr. Tan couldn't join us today. There are a few questions I would love to pose to him about his recording and presentation. I think the point around how government policy failures and the quick fix of immigration stoke racism and xenophobic feelings are talking points that we're seeing more and more as more and more small countries need to straddle the line between adequate social policy and using immigration as a quick remedy to employment rates and critical thinking skills. Finally, we're doing amazing on time. We will move to our final speaker, who will speak on populism, religion, and anti-LGBTQ sentiments in Malaysia, Dr. Shanon Shah. Dr. Shanon, please, I won't take any more time or attention away from our audience who are eagerly waiting for your wisdom. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Neo. Thank you to ECPS, to Buland for the invitation, and to Professors Garry, Rodan, Ahmad, Fauzi, and Syaza, and Kenneth Tan. I'll just jump right into it in the interest of time. So my presentation extends some observations I made in a peer-reviewed article that I published in 2019, titled Populist Politics in the New Malaysia. And I'm extending some of these insights to explore the controversies on LGBTQ, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and queer issues in Malaysia in the aftermath of its two most recent general elections in 2018 and 2022. And I do this by looking at the connections between populist and religious, especially Islamist, politics. Now, I begin by revisiting the major headlines on LGBT issues. I'll just recap the chronology, which confronted the newly elected governments of 2018 and 2022. So I do this to introduce the usefulness of approaching some views of populism. So one especially of it as a style of moral politics, and another a spatial metaphor to describe populist politics. And I find these helpful to analyze these anti-LGBTQ controversies. Now, this is quite different from claiming that these LGBTQ controversies somehow offer clear proof that Malaysian politics is somehow shaped by something called populist ideology. That's not what I'm doing. And I'm also focusing very narrowly on discourses that specifically use the Anglophone term LGBTQ and its derivatives. So I'm not focusing on the diverse lived experiences of gender and sexual diversity that have actually enjoyed quite a high degree of tolerance historically in the Malay world. So instead, I'm applying just some insights from some studies of populism that I think can be particularly helpful in analyzing certain aspects of these anti-LGBTQ controversies within the wider landscape of Malaysia's political transition. So this presentation is going to be quite exploratory, but I also believe that it can add some critical nuance to some of the dominant assumptions in many public debates that take the so-called Islamization of Malaysian politics, including the rise of the so-called Green Wave, for granted. So let's begin by visualizing the timeline of events specifically related to LGBTQ issues that emerged in the immediate aftermath of the swearing in of the governments in 2018 and 2022. So let's go first to the most recent election. So our timeline starts when the election returns a hung parliament, and then there's some political negotiation that needs to happen, and then a unity coalition government is sworn in on the 24th of November 2022, with Anwar Ibrahim from Pakatan Harapan as Prime Minister of Malaysia. So this is the 24th of November. Less than a month after this, on the 19th of December, a controversy erupts in the chambers of parliament, in the House of Commons, the Dewan Rakyat. There is a debate on the coverage from a little-known Italian website that claims that Malaysia has elected its first gay prime minister. This is raised by an MP in parliament, and there's ruckus, and then there needs to be a response. A couple of weeks after this, in the new year, in 2023, Anwar Ibrahim as Prime Minister declares that there will be absolutely zero tolerance for LGBT, communism, and secularism by the unity government. A couple of months after this, in May 2023, there's a controversy where some watches by the brand Swatch, which have rainbow wristbands to symbolize pride and LGBTQ inclusion, they get raided by the Pakatan Harapan authorities, and that becomes a huge media storm. And then a couple of months after that, in July, the Pakatan Harapan government cancels an entire festival, the Good Vibes Festival, because one of the acts that performs at that festival, the 1975 band, their lead singer Matt Healy kisses one of his male bandmates on stage and uses this as an opportunity to condemn what he says is Malaysia's homophobic politics and religious morals and so on. So that's the post-2018, post-2022 election. Let's go to the post-2018 election. So our timeline starts when the election returns a simple majority, unexpected, for the Pakatan Harapan coalition. And then it is sworn into government on the 11th of May with Prime Minister Dr. Mahathir Mohamad as Prime Minister for his second time in office after stepping down in 2003. So there's a lot of color about this in the media. You know, this old dictator, the oldest prime minister in the world, becomes prime minister of this new reformist coalition. It's a David and Goliath story. But then quite soon after that, a couple of months after that, we have our first LGBT controversy facing this new government. So there's an LGBT activist, Numan Afifi, who works in the office of Minister Syed Saddiq, Minister of Youth and Sports. This results in a lot of controversy. He quits, right, on the 9th of July. And then in some liberal sectors of Malaysia, Syed Saddiq's response becomes a controversy as well, because some people are claiming that he didn't do enough to defend Numan Afifi. And then a month after that, there's another controversy at the Georgetown Literary Festival, which had an exhibition of, you know, heroic Malaysians, and two of these Malaysians are LGBTQ activists, Pangki Tek and Nisha Ayub. So because of this controversy, the festival takes down their portraits. And then a month after that, there's another controversy where the past ruled state of Terengganu carries out punishments for two women who are accused of engaging in lesbian sex. And then a few weeks after this, Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad declares that Malaysia will never ever accept same-sex relationships or same-sex marriages. So that's the declaration. So these are the timelines. And I think it's quite striking that these issues erupted, you know, within the first 6 months of these governments being sworn in. So there's a strong resemblance in some ways, but I think there are some key differences. So let's look at these differences in the interest of time, according to three main variables. One, the chronology of events, which I think I've already summarized, but you can see here, like I've come up with some labels. Like, I think the first strike post-2022 happened much more quickly. It was within 1 month of the government being sworn in. In 2018, the first strike took about 2 months. And there's a ritual of disavowal by the Prime Minister in either case. But again, post-2022, this disavowal happens a lot more quickly. And the aftershocks were actually ongoing. But post-2018, they probably lasted up until the Sheraton move, which resulted in the fall of the Pakatan Harapan government, and then the COVID pandemic and how the new government had to deal with it, led by Perikatan Nasional. So, but with this current government, the situation is ongoing. And then the apparent triggers and sources of these controversies are quite different as well. As I've listed post-20, my table, I've mixed up the columns. Under post-2022, it should be the external actors. That's the wrong column. So it was the Italian, it was an Italian newspaper, a little-known Italian newspaper. It was a foreign band of watches. It was a English, band, the 1975. The only internal actor here was the Good Vibes Festival, right? And I think this is important, and I'll come back to it. Whereas in 2018, the apparent triggers were all domestic. They were local LGBTQ activists. They were local organizers of a local literary festival. It was Malaysians who got punished, these two women in Terengganu, right? And of course, the role of the Prime Minister in both transitions is important. Post 2018, again, sorry, I've got my tables mixed up. I will correct these when I send the slides back to Bulent. But Mahathir Mohamad, Prime Minister under the first Pakatan Harapan government of 2018, back in the day, he was an agent or a perpetrator of anti-LGBTQ rhetoric as Prime Minister, right? And the person who succeeds as Prime Minister in 2022 was actually his victim, Anwar Ibrahim. So this is the Prime Minister we have now, who was a victim of anti-sodomy legislation in the past, like repeatedly. And I think this is also important. So the summary is done. How might a combination of analytical insights from studies of populism and the dynamics of religious politics help us to make sense of these two clusters, these two chronologies of anti-LGBTQ polemics in Malaysia? So I think firstly, it's noteworthy that one, these are controversies about issues that are hugely significant in Malaysia's politicized moral and religious landscape. And two, that they emerged almost immediately after very hotly contested elections in which a coalition that has positioned itself as democratically reformist has succeeded in taking power. Now, these patterns remind me of the characterization of populism, not as a full-blown ideology, but rather as a style of moral politics. And this is not a completely original observation from me either, because close observers of Malaysian politics have also noted the presence of what they call savior politics in Pakatan's electoral campaign in 2018, which was also present in 2022. The idea that these elections were a do or die or now or never moment to save Malaysia from corruption and degeneration and so on, right? Now, secondly, there's also a spatial metaphor that some scholars use to distinguish between populism and nationalism, which I find useful. So I'm not saying that these are separate phenomenon and it's always one thing or the other. In fact, as our previous speakers, Prof. Ahmad Fauzi and Prof. Syaza have demonstrated, they often intertwine in new ways under new global and domestic conditions in Malaysia. But I still find this spatial metaphor to distinguish populism and nationalism helpful to identify the strands of argument that are present in constructions of opponents or enemies in Malaysia's current political transition. So to summarize, with populism, the construction of insiders and outsiders, or the construction of us versus them, happens vertically, right? So it's about underdogs at the bottom challenging a corrupt elite at the top. So this is the vertical construction. And this was clearly present in Pakatan Harapan's 2018 campaign, where they were like, we are going to take down Najib and the 1MDB elites and so on, right? With nationalism, the construction of outsiders is horizontal. So there's a pure race of us, ordinary Malays or Muslims, as Syaza and Ahmad Fauzi have said, that belongs to this nation, right? As opposed to these polluting races of immigrants or outsiders or squatters and so on. And this element, as the previous speakers have said, has been clearly present in many political campaigns in the past and NGO activities as well by some nationalist and Islamist actors. But the added relevance here is that both of these elements are informing now very competing narratives of Malaysian nationhood. What kind of nation are we actually, and do we want to be? Are we primarily an Islamic and therefore Malay nation state, or are we actually a multicultural, diverse nation? And what happens to these narratives during a political transition in which a significant block of contenders that has been suppressed and repressed actually articulates its goal on the basis of democratic reforms and then actually achieves success at the ballot box? So what happens to these narratives now? So that's why I think this spatial metaphor can help us to comprehend how and why this is happening and how the rhetoric or process of Islamization fits into this transitional context. So just to elaborate on this point briefly, post-2018, the Pakatan Harapan government was charged by its nationalist critics with being pro-LGBTQ because they were saying it had an elitist internal agenda. So this is a vertical argument by its nationalist opponents, right, from UMNO and PAS at that point. And this rhetoric, as the previous speakers have pointed out, was actually, it happened alongside a horizontal element in which parties like the DAP were accused of overstepping their bounds in government. And so if you remember, there were also controversies about Malaysia possibly acceding to a UN Convention on Racial Discrimination, ICERD. And the PH government, the Pakatan Harapan government, found itself being caught on the back foot by PAS, the PAS-ruled government of Terengganu, when it tried to exert its political rights to administer Islam in the way that it wanted, using LGBTQ issues as a testing ground, right? But in 2022, the picture is slightly different, because the first shot that was fired was a personal attack against Anwar, right? Because of his own alleged sexual past, you know, and this was like focusing on a foreign source, possibly trying to paint Anwar as a proxy of foreign agents or something. And then since then, it's the unity government that has actually been issuing its own preemptive strikes. So it issued, you know, directives to raid the Swatch outlets. It banned the Good Vibes Festival, right? And there's always this insinuation that this LGBT stuff is a foreign threat, as opposed to in post-2018, where it was these internal activists that were the problem for that government at the time, right? So these insights from studies on populism, I think we can take them further by bringing in an analysis of so-called Islamization into the picture, which I think Syaza and Ahmad Fauzi have done in other ways as well. And I'm going to touch on some different areas here. So for me, I find the term Islamization a bit unclear, because when I use it, I don't really know what's going on, what levels is this happening, who is driving it, who is responding to it. It's a bit chicken and egg for me. But I feel that when we look at these insights, these metaphors and elements of studies of populism, I think it clarifies some things about, you know, the way Islamization is talked about and then what's actually happening in Malaysian society. So the first broad narrative that I'd like to bring into this conversation, I think, can be exemplified by a recent article by Zaina Anwar, who's the co-founder and former executive director of the Islamic feminist group Sisters in Islam, which has been the kind of thorn in the side of many of the Islamist political parties and NGOs, right? So she writes in this paper, you know, a very blunt question, like, where are we in Malaysia after decades of Islamization? So the first thing she's doing is she's taking for granted that there is something called Islamization. It's been happening for decades. And her argument is that it has destroyed Malaysian politics, right? And it's been enabled or cynically encouraged by the political establishment. So this is a very vertical argument of Islamization. Let's call it the "it's getting worse" thesis. So the second broad narrative, I think, is less well known. And for me, it's represented by the work of, you know, as far as I know, the anthropologist Michael Pelletz. There are probably lots of others doing this sort of work as well. So he looks at long-term trends in the judgments that have been issued by Sharia courts in Malaysia. And he finds that actually, over the longer term, there are discernible and significant improvements in the delivery of Muslim women's rights, specifically under Islamic family laws in Malaysia. And he attributes this both to vertical forces, so the actual administration of the Sharia courts, including by Sharia judges, but he also credits horizontal forces. So he's saying that over the longer term, the activism of groups like Sisters in Islam actually works and is actually producing these good effects for Muslim women. So we'll call this the "is getting maybe a little bit better" improvement situation. I say maybe a little bit because even Pelletz admits that this improvement is only for heteronormative Muslim marriages involving men and women, right, in Muslim families. So he speculates that actually something worse might be happening for sexual minorities in Malaysia. But I still think this is a valuable observation. There's a lot that we can say in here about the impacts of neoliberalism and capitalist governance, but we'll save that. I don't have time for that. I just think it's important to park this here. Now, the third broad narrative is really an open question. That's why I've called it Pandora's Box, about where far-right online politics might be heading in Malaysia. So in Malaysia, people are no strangers to the existence of cyber troopers and cyber trolls. I mean, they've been a mainstay of the political landscape over at least the past 2 decades, right? The question now is, how will some of the new motifs of far-right hyper-nationalism influence the political landscape and social norms? So the new additions to Malay nationalist rhetoric are suddenly people are talking about Black Lives Matter. We are anti-Black Lives Matter culture, and this idea of the Chinese being natural outsiders. There's also now an anti-Indian rhetoric in reinventing Malaysian history, the anti-Chola rhetoric that we find among far-right Malay groups. And of course, there's the anti-LGBTQ and anti-Semitic stuff. That's like, the baseline. It's always there. Can we call this a truly horizontal phenomenon, especially when we know that trolls and cyber troopers have historically been enabled or even cultivated by the political establishment in Malaysia? So I can't answer this. Let's just stop and call it Pandora's box. Now, I bring up these three broad narratives to provide some critical context to the different ways that we can conceptualize Islamization in Malaysia in relation to populist politics as well. And I think this is important given the ways that Islam or Islamization are somehow taken for granted by many commentators as somehow the main or natural explanation for anti-LGBTQ attitudes in Malaysia. I don't think it's that simple. So as I said in my introduction, this presentation is exploratory and it's focused on the usefulness of some aspects of studies in populism to make sense of anti-LGBTQ attitudes in Malaysia. Now, I haven't said this explicitly, but I hope it's clear that I've chosen to do this because LGBTQ issues have evolved into a very central system with highly contested diagnosis and prescriptions in any temperature check now about Malaysia's political health. And I've specifically pointed towards the usefulness of approaching populism, not as a full-blown ideology or political project, but as a political style that involves a kind of moral politics or savior politics. And I've also argued that the spatial metaphors used to distinguish populism and nationalism through vertical and horizontal elements are also quite helpful. And they help to clarify the competing narratives of Malaysian nationhood as either is Malaysia an Islamic or Malay state, or is it a diverse multicultural nation? And I've argued that these insights from studies in populism can add some very much needed nuance to arguments that generalize trends in Islamization, which is usually used as kind of a fallback master explanation for anti-LGBTQ attitudes in Malaysia. And I'd like to end with an irresponsibly speculative question. Are LGBTQ controversies new rituals of confrontation in Malaysia's political transition? Thank you.
There we go. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Shanon, for your really interesting speech, talk. Okay, everyone, we've had a wonderful panel by our 4 esteemed panelists. I hope you are as informed about populism in Singapore and Malaysia as I am now. Seeing the similarities between populism in different regions of the world is always really interesting, fascinating to me as a populist scholar. You would assume that the different regions would produce different kinds, but they all seem to follow the exact same model, framework, and behavioral patterns, which is just, to me, absolutely mind-blowing. We will now move to our Q&A session. Dr. Rodan?
Okay, you want me to
moderate
my session now?
That would be, yes.
Fantastic. Fine.
I'm not sure if you can see the questions in the chat. Would you like to read them or should I read them for you?
I see them at the moment. Okay, I'll take them from the top.
Okay.
It reads, Dr. Ahmad, Fauzi, would you say that the reported support for ISIS in 2015 was because at that time they were mainly seen as fighting Bashar al-Assad rather than committing terrorism?
Okay, thanks, Garry. And Zulfikar Sharif, I think I've met him in Singapore a few years back, the person who asked this. Okay, that for me is certainly one of the explanations, okay, one of the reasons, but you go deeper into that, I think there's a strong strain of anti-Shiism okay, among the Malay Muslims, establishment Malay Muslims. In fact, basically the Sunni Malay Muslims, and this narrative, which is wrong actually. Okay, this narrative, okay, that because Assad, okay, which is supported by Iran, which is also Shia, okay, and Assad himself is Shia, actually he's Alawite, okay, and in fact the Alawites and the Imamat Shias, they're quite different in their orientation and their beliefs, but there's this narrative that went on very strongly in 2015 that they are similar and they are victimizing Sunni Muslims over there, and of course, they as people who claim that they are Sunnis, the ISIS, although some would say that they are Salafis or Wahhabis or whatever, but in 2015, it was very early, okay, during the upsurge of ISIS, and there were contradictory reports coming on who were they actually. So I believe that that's two of the reasons. This strong anti-Shiism, this feeling that Sunnis were being victimized, and also okay, the thing that Muslims themselves, Syrians, okay, were being victimized by an authoritarian government. I would just wonder, okay, whether if the same question was posed to later, when the reality of ISIS, brutality, will make clear whether that, whether the same results would come out. That's a question which remains unsolved. But that, I think, this anti-Shi'i strain in Malaysian Islam, I would relate that also to the second question on ISMA, okay, on the sectarian divide. Because what I see from Malaysian Islamist populism is that it worsens the sectarian divide, okay, because this belief, okay, and this conviction that Islam in Malaysia is of a certain denomination, of a certain type, and as Sunni Muslims, you have to adhere to that type, okay. Whereas if you look empirically at some of the evidence, for instance, if you look at Muhammad Faisal Musa's very recent book chapter in the book Trending Islam, just published last month, I think, by the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore. He did some empirical fieldwork and he interviewed Baha'is, he interviewed Ahmadis, he interviewed Shias. So they're all there, except that they don't manifest their non-Sunnism openly because of the character and the situation, the environment of Malaysian Islam. And yet we see from time to time, okay, that there are raids and so on. Of course, I think during this unity government's time, this has very much decreased. But the main school of thought, okay, I think in Malaysia is very virulently Sunni in a way that doesn't allow other schools of thought in Islam to be externalized. Okay, and I think ISMA basically follows that orientation as well.
Thank you. We got very little time left, so we need brief responses to questions. We had a question. So thank you, Zulfikir Muhammad Sharif for that question. We have a question here from Fiza Batul. It says, my question is to Dr. Ahmad and Dr. Syaza. How does ISMA and Islamist populist parties in Malaysia address the sectarian divide? And can you keep your answers very brief, please?
Dr. Syaza, please, because I've responded on the...
Yes, I'll take that because Prof. Fauzi already mentioned about ISMA. I'm going to add something to what Prof. Fauzi said. It's not just that in Malaysia, it has to be Sunni Islam. It also has to be Sunni, Shafi'i Sunni Islam. So it's a very narrow, very specific kind of Islamic school of thought that is generally accepted by the population. So in answering the question, how do Islamist populists address this, is the same as how they would address the others, such as the LGBTQs that we were discussing, that they are otherized. So those who do not subscribe to Sunni Islam, even like I say, even those who follows a different mazahib than Shafi'i, would be otherized, and the political parties would use this to their advantage again to show that the country is under threat. But the funny thing is now the country is under threat by fellow Muslims, but the way that they argue is that these are not real Muslims according to their point of view. So it's very easy for the populists to use this again, to use the emotional trope that we discussed earlier to gain more support for them, and this explains what has been going on in the past few years. So that's my brief answer to that.
Thank you very much. Bulent, do you have a question?
Thank you very much, Garry, and thank you very much for these interesting presentations of all the participants of panel. My question is to either Dr. Shukri or Professor Fauzi. I wonder about the roles played by international Islamist radical movements or foreign Islamist movements in the Islamization of Malaysia, and maybe the radicalization of some groups, especially the youth in Malaysia. Could you make an assessment about the role of Jamaat Islami or Muslim Brotherhood that Mr. Fauzi mentioned during his presentation, and maybe the Mohammadiyah movement in Indonesia? Thank you.
Can I request Dr. Syaza to go first?
I was about to say that I think Prof. Fauzi should take this because this is your strength, isn't it?
Oh, because if I answer this, I'll take at least an hour.
Another lecture.
Okay. Briefly speaking, I think their roles are big. Their roles are significant, and you can see this in many writings, especially the roles of the students who went to the Middle East to study. Okay, strangely speaking, not just in the Middle East, but also in the UK and US, in Western countries, where they were, they were familiarized and they were socialized into these Muslim Brotherhood groups and so on. So this is one of the sources where this came from. And of course, later we get where the place where Dr. Syaza is serving now, International Islamic University, which itself is a model, okay, which was imported from the ideas of Maududi and Faruqi, okay, who were themselves, of course, involved with. Maududi was involved, of course, directly with Jamaat Islami, okay, as you know. So I think a lot of these have been, have been written. I think you can email me later. I will give you some sources, I guess. Yes, Syaza.
I don't think I have much to add to that. Maybe we can go to the next question. I see.
Okay, can just mention that book, which was it Fiza Batul Asia, the book which I mentioned just now. I'll show it on the screen, which I just brought. It's called Trending Islam. Okay, you just and my chapter is in there. That's why I got a complimentary copy. It's just very new. I wrote something here on Salafi Jihadi and Malaysia's battle against extremism. So it's I think Google Trending Islam or some of the editors. The editors are Faiza Musa, Afra Alatas, who's Farid Alatas' daughter, Okay, and An Suryana in Indonesian.
Okay, thank
it's published by ICS in Singapore.
Thank you. I think given the time constraints, I'll just make some overall assessments as requested by Bullen. They will be very limited given the time, so I'll have to be very selective. So in the case of Fauzi's paper, his presentation was so rich and there's so much there for me that the thing that I picked out that I thought was especially useful was when he built on from the observation that to the extent that there are Islamic populists in Malaysia, they tend to be non-violent. And really what they may reject pluralism and legal rules and all that and other things that are obviously very significant. But it's the concern about the context and what gives rise to the predisposition to form these views. These are not static views, they're more prevalent in one point in the history of Malaysia than another. And I was particularly attracted to the importance that was given emphasis to about the failure to take seriously, in effect, the concerns and perspectives of grassroots organisations that are dealing with the practical problems associated with unequal development and various other problems. And he made the point that even in his own work, and he talked about an obsession amongst many Western funding agencies with violence. This is not peculiar just to Malaysia and the region. There are many Western governments who even look at parts of the world purely through a security lens. But that's become extremely accentuated since 9/11. And what we should be doing, I think, is exactly what Fauzi's arguing for, more consideration to what gives rise to the attraction of extremist nativist ideologies. So I thought that was crucially important, and has much instruction for international aid and the relative focus in trying to bring about better outcomes for people in countries where there might be extremist groups. Syaza's paper, for me, again, another rich paper, very methodical and persuasive. The question I would have is, again, it builds on this theme that I've already talked about. She asked, democracy has failed to properly represent the Malays, or quoted somebody to that effect. And so the question that, there's a vacuum there that's been filled by the ideology of civilizational Islam, which has proved very attractive. The question I would ask is how, and of course there's no possibility of dealing with this in a 15-minute presentation, so I take that as given, but to me, to build on what Fauzi said, we would want to know something about the relative importance of the unequal outcomes of market capitalism and the particular way in which resources are allocated as a result of that, to, again, an historical feeling for how more or less and on what conditions this happens. There's part of that in there, and I think the emphasis on the international dimension is really relevant to that question, but that's something that I think would be useful to add in any extended analysis. In the case of the Singapore paper by Kenneth Paul Tan, I found this quite fascinating because, amongst other things, it's turned the focus onto the ruling party and tried to understand how is it that there has been emergence of what he sees signs of populism, certainly xenophobic and nationalist sentiments. And he's provided a very elaborate and, for the time available, account of the material conditions under which that has emerged. And I find it especially intriguing that he's effectively arguing that the PAP has laid the bed that it's now finding itself in, namely through the evolution of the PAP as a technocratic and elitist government. Not only has it presided over an unequal set of outcomes for Singapore, so that there are some who feel completely left out of that so-called successful development project, but also that the elite has changed itself, that the technocratic elite has become more aloof of the population. And so in effect, he's arguing that it doesn't seem to have the capacity to get itself out of this. And so he's extrapolating from that the future looks almost dysfunctional for the sort of governance and certainly for any political resuscitation by the PAP. There would need to be very stern re-examination of itself. It's, in effect, he seems to be arguing, stoking the fires of populist sentiment. And the final paper I thought was very interesting for its attempt to introduce complexity and to combine time perspective alongside conceptual flexibility to try and look at the complexity of the different forms and ways of understanding populism. And it's far removed in its ultimate position from Laclau's idea of particular sorts of behaviours being associated with populism. It's building on the idea that there are performative and other aspects to populism. And I do think that the great value of this paper is that it's taking very seriously the historical specificity out of which opportunities to promote populism and the form that they take really matter. And so that's something that I think lends itself to potentially very fertile elaboration in written up form as those ideas develop. So in conclusion, I think we've been presented with quite a lot within a short period of time to think about, and quite a few of the things that have been mentioned from these speakers have stimulated me to already write notes down on things I need to read from those things that they've introduced, as well as their own original thoughts on these matters. So thank you very much for a very rich set of presentations.
Thank you, Dr. Rodan, for your moderation and your time. Thank you to all our panelists for your insights and your time. This concludes the 6th session of Mapping Global Populism. I hope it was as informative for you, as it was for me. We're over the limit. I have 2 quick announcements. The first is that we have 2 panels in next month. The one is on the 17th of November, if I'm not mistaken, and that is on populism and electoral politics around the world. You can register on our website, but Bulent has put a link to that panel in the chat box. So please take a second to register for that. I'm sure it'll be really interesting. And our 7th panel for the Mapping Global Populism series, we'll be moving slightly up towards Thailand to navigate populism and authoritarianism there. So please register for both those panels. Please go back to our website and our YouTube channel, ECPS, to watch today's panel and past panels and other programs. That's what I'm looking for. Thank you again for your time. I hope you all a lovely day, a lovely week, and a lovely remainder of the month. Take care.